Does the natural order give any evidence of having been intelligently designed? Well, since 1953, we have learned that cellular processes are driven by an extremely complex system of binary coding, DNA.
Human DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created.
If computer code does not originate without intelligent code writers, how do you get code that is far more complex without an intelligent source? Enlightenment philosophical dogma does not allow that, so good comrades don't even consider it. The appearance of design is becoming impossible to ignore.
Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. The design inference comes naturally. The reason people think that a designer created the world is because it looks designed. I think we should quit tiptoeing around this inference and admit that life looks designed because it was.
But to preserve atheistic dogma, biologists are continually reminded to deny the implication of what they observe and believe that evolution did it randomly.
Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved.
The fine-tuning of the universe and precise balance of factors allowing for life on Earth suggests something more than random accident is required.
Astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing, one with the very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the right conditions required to permit life, and one which has an underlying, one might say supernatural, plan.
Many elements of the universe do appear to have been designed for a purpose. Christians view the appearance of design as possibly being evidence of a designer. Secularists admit the appearance of design, but are unwilling to consider the possibility of a divine designer because of their prior philosophical commitments. Genesis 1, 2 through 10 indicates that the early Earth was covered with water, so Laplace and Kant's nebular hypothesis was formulated to claim just the opposite, that the Earth began very hot, covered with a sea of molten magma, requiring hundreds of millions of years to cool before continents and oceans could form, and then life. However, with the Bible removed from science, recent scientific studies suggest that the early Earth actually did begin, with a considerable amount of water on it.
Our seas may have arrived much earlier on our planet than previously thought. The water sloshing in Earth's oceans, and coursing through its canyons, may have been with the planet since it first started taking shape, new research suggests.
Even 95% covered with water through the first 80% of its existence. It is amazing how often scientific evidence eventually starts looking like what the Bible teaches after the Bible has been moved far enough off the table that nobody will make that connection. As a predictive model, Genesis 1, 11 through 13 and 20 through 27 offers three very clear propositions concerning the origin of life, diversity of life, and human origins. First, the origin of life is portrayed in terms of biogenesis, which is what we consistently observe, that life arises from a prior living source. Pasteur and others demonstrated that flies and maggots did not generate out of inanimate matter, but came only from pre-existing life, when flies laid eggs on the rotting material. Thus, life on Earth coming from a pre-existing living creator is a very logical, if not a scientific, idea. Those who want to believe that life generated out of inanimate matter by natural processes alone continue to do so on the basis of their philosophical commitments, not because of any observation or convincing experimental evidence. Second, as for the diversity of life, Genesis 1 also teaches that a number of original major groups of life forms appeared at about the same time, which would allow for limited variation within those major groups. If this is true, the fossils should look like most or all of the major groups appeared at about the same time and an orchard, with many separate and distinct trees rather than a single great tree of life, as Darwin asserted. The Apostle Paul later said that all flesh is not the same, but has existed in several distinct groups from the beginning. And lest you think that Paul could not have been referring to something like Darwinism, Anaximander and Empedocles produced a story very similar to Darwinism over 500 years before Paul's time. In Chapter 9 of The Origin of Species, Darwin expressed his concern that known fossils look nothing like his branching tree of life. Paleontologists since Darwin's time have known that this problem never got any better, but to protect secular mythology, they have kept this as their trade secret. As early as the 1920s, well-credentialed scientists were openly admitting that the major groups of life forms all seemed to have appeared at about the same time, fully formed in clearly distinct major groups, which is exactly what Genesis 1 describes.
So we see that the fossil record, the actual history of the animal life on the earth, bears out the assumption that at its very first appearance, animal life in its broader features was in essentially the same form as that in which we know it. Thus, so far as concerns the major groups of animals, the creationists seem to have the better of the argument. There is not the slightest evidence that any of the major group arose from any other.
The body plans that evolved in the Cambrian, by and large, served as the blueprints for those seen today. Few new major body plans have appeared since that time. Just as all automobiles are fundamentally modeled after the first four-wheel vehicles, all the evolutionary changes since the Cambrian period have been mere variations on those basic themes. Evolutionary biology's deepest paradox concerns this strange discontinuity. Why haven't new animal body plans continued to crawl out of the evolutionary cauldron during the past hundreds of millions of years? Why are the ancient body plans so stable?
The mythological nature of Darwinism is also seen in Darwin's imagined belief that biological variation was unlimited, so that protozoa could gradually change into all other life forms, because he was unaware of the genetic limits on variation that Mendel was working on, but had not yet published. Darwin needed a biological change mechanism and borrowed Lamarck's idea of inherited adaptations, which was later found to not work, and was replaced with random genetic mutation. But wait a minute. In general biology, we were all taught that mutations are mistakes in gene replication, most of them neutral, and the rest damaging or lethal. How could mutations change protozoa into people?
Well, we're here. And Darwinism is the only possible explanation, so it must have happened.
Third, humans are biologically similar to animals because both have bodies made from earthly materials animated by the breath of life from God. This similarity makes sense also because humans and animals live in the same environment. However, humans are a special creation with a unique similarity to the Creator in that we are given the ability and responsibility to oversee and take care of other life forms, as well as rationally investigate nature. We were human beings when created, and have continued to be so ever since. Humans are one group, for they do not divide into kinds, which is a great argument against racism. Accordingly, there should not be a clear trail of descent from any of the great apes, as evolutionists assume. In a later video, I will summarize how the human evolution notion was imagined without evidence in the mid-1800s and has struggled ever since to come up with alleged human ancestors that all the experts can agree on. After 40-50 years from the books by Lyle Huxley and Darwin, believers were becoming so desperate for evidence to support their beliefs that they were fooled for over 40 years by an intentional fraud, and got all excited about early man in North America from a single tooth that turned out to have come from an extinct pig. To this day, the experts still cannot agree on a pathway leading from the great apes to Homo sapiens. Evolutionists tend to misunderstand the biblical concept of creation. The Bible does not teach that all species were created at the beginning, which would mean that there was no variation or new species showing up later in biological history. This notion did not come from the Bible, but originated with Plato's Great Chain of Being, which was blended with biblical teaching by the early scholastics before modern science began. Genesis 1 teaches that God made a number of original major kinds of life forms at about the same time, that then reproduced with whatever capacity for variation and adaptation they have, but within those separate major groups. There is no biblical reason to reject biological variation and increasing diversity over time within those major groups. The major objection to evolution is not over the idea of variation within the major kinds, but to Darwin's larger grand transformation scheme. As part of his initial response to the first sin, Genesis 3:17-19 tells us that God imposed a curse upon nature that involves harder work, thorns and thistles, and physical aging and death. The psalmist said that the earth will grow old, wear out, and perish. In Romans 8:20 and 21, Paul spoke of it in terms of the creation was subjected to futility, slavery to corruption. And John said the world is passing away. In its rejection of the biblical worldview, the Enlightenment embraced philosophical materialism and naturalism, and imagined a self-organizing natural order that, if freed from religious restraints, would inherently move towards a paradise on earth. While not what Enlightenment speculators wanted to believe, the effects of the Decay Curse have always been clearly observable.
Man has long been aware that his world has a tendency to fall apart. Tools wear out, fishing nets need repair, roofs leak, iron rusts, wood decays, loved ones sicken and die, relatives quarrel, and nations make war.
However, during the 1800s, several scientists studying heat transfer stumbled upon the old curse from Eden. In defining the first two principles of thermodynamics, they first realized that there appears to be a fixed amount of matter and energy in the universe. Matter can be converted into energy. Firewood can be burned to produce heat energy. But with every conversion, there is a net loss, as heat energy warms the body, but escapes and ceases to be available for any further work. Maintaining the operation of a steam engine requires a continuing supply of heat. So with heat transfer, there is a net loss. Physicists formalize this reality in the second principle, which describes the downward spiral of natural systems towards increasing disorder. Enlightenment promoters have, from the beginning, claimed to be operating solely on reason and science, but they're really more focused on ideological philosophy that appears to justify rejection of the Bible. Embracing materialism and naturalism logically led to a mythology of inherent evolutionary progress to explain everything. Once it became secular orthodoxy in Western universities, even questioning it is a career breaker. So how have Enlightenment advocates reacted to thermodynamics? Well, the first response has been to simply ignore it.
An uninvited guest at any discussion of the origin of life and of evolution, from the materialistic reductionist point of view, is the role of thermodynamic entropy and the heat death of the universe, which it predicts.
The second response has been to acknowledge it, but then assert that there can be local exceptions where energy is supplied. Because the sun supplies energy to planet Earth, chemistry and life could overcome the second principle, and thus the Darwinian illusion is preserved. Well, how have physicists responded? The famous Michio Kaku said that the second principle is one of the iron laws of physics, which is the reason why even living things succumb to aging, decay, and death. Others have asserted that the second law never breaks down under any circumstances. If you think about it, supplying energy does not fix the problem. Raw sun energy can only be constructively applied to vegetation that has an already operating chlorophyll system in place. Otherwise, vegetable matter gets burned to a crisp. Unless slowly conditioned to it, or sunblock is applied, humans get sunburn, and that quickly ruins the vacation. Even for those who seem to handle it, their skin either ages and wrinkles faster or develops skin cancer, or both. And you don't dump 5 gallons of gasoline on your car, but you put it into a tank connected by tubing to a designed system for regulating fuel mixture and controlled injection into engine cylinders for precisely timed ignition. Modern wishful thinking aside, the Bible appears to be right on the direction of natural processes. We face it every day as our bodies age and everything we have wears out. Genesis 1 through 5 portrays humans from their appearance as capable of examining and naming other life forms, entering into marriage relationships, self-centered worldliness and spirituality, speech, city building, nomadic herding, music, and metallurgy. Genesis 5 portrays pre-flood lifespans as being much longer than is common now, but there are several reasons why this is plausible. If direct creations, the earliest humans would have been genetically pure and very healthy. Every cell in the human body is replaced in less than 7 years. So for those who live to 70, this process has repeated 10 times. Why could it not have occurred 100 times in a better environment? Evidence of past animal and vegetable life forms near the present poles suggests that temperatures were once warmer and much more uniform all over the Earth, which might have provided a climate conducive to great size and longer lifespans. Ancient peoples in the Middle East, the Sumerians and their descendants, all believed that people had lived much longer lives prior to the Great Flood. After the flood, it appears that conditions were changing and the lifespans quickly tapered down to what we see in our time. Evolution asserts gradual improvement based on superiority and survivability, with size clearly an advantage in the struggle for mates and resources. However, the biggest and presumably the most fit life forms existed in the past. The fossil record verifies something else that the Bible mentions. Giant life forms existed before the watery catastrophe that killed and buried many life forms that became fossils. Genesis 6:4 indicates that the Nephilim were on the earth prior to the flood. The Greek translation of the passage in the Septuagint employed the word from which we get gigantic. The term was also used in Numbers 13, verse 33, in reference to the giant people that Israel encountered in the land of Canaan. The Nephilim were large life forms, and the fossil record indicates that many animals in the past were much larger than their modern counterparts. Today, we think of large birds in terms of ostriches, but Australia was once home to a 10-foot-tall, 1,500-pound bird known as the Dromornis stertoni. The moa, once found in New Zealand, reached heights of 12 feet. Penguins were 6 feet tall. In 1980, a fossilized bird was found in South America that resembles an eagle in form, but was 3 times as large. Whereas a bald eagle might have a wingspan of 8 feet, the giant Teratorn had a wingspan of 25 feet, and its body would have been as large as that of a man. In 1975, the fossilized bones of a pterosaur, a flying reptile, were found in Texas, indicating a wingspan that must have been around 51 feet. Reptiles, specifically dinosaurs, were huge by modern standards. Tyrannosaurus rex and similar predators, or scavengers, averaged at least 45 feet long, while some sauropods, four-legged, long neck and tail, grew up to 130 feet long. Australia was once home to the Megalania, lizards resembling Komodo dragons, but up to 26 feet long. Since 1964, researchers have been aware that some prehistoric crocodiles reached a length of 40 feet and could weigh up to 9 tons, with fossils found in the Sahara Desert and Texas. A coal mine in Colombia yielded vertebrae of the Titan boa, an ancient relative of the anaconda that would have reached sizes well over 40 feet in length and weighed well over a ton. Land mammals also exhibited the same increased size. The Megatherium, or giant ground sloth, weighed up to 8 tons and reached 20 feet high, standing upright. The Paraceratherium stood 16 feet high at the shoulder and would have weighed 15 to 20 tons. The Elasmotherium would have been considerably larger than a modern-day rhino. A report in September 2003 identified a gigantic rodent that once lived in what is now Venezuela, the Goya, probably weighed around 1,500 pounds. Evidence found in Alaska indicates that beavers were once 7.5 feet long. Moose were 12 feet high at the shoulder. The Irish elk was 9 foot tall. Bison that were at least 7.5 feet tall. Camels over 10 feet tall. Remains of a giant ancient bear were found in Canada. Its size was estimated to have been 11 feet high and 3,500 pounds. Otters were once the size of a modern wolf. Remains of a 500-pound armadillo found in the Antarctic. Gigantopithecus would have been 8 to 9 feet tall. Rats were 3 times their current size. Foot-long cockroaches. Dragonflies with a 2.5-foot wingspan. The oceans were filled with life forms much larger than those today. Sea turtles have been found measuring up to 8 feet across. Giant sea scorpions were once much larger than modern humans. Many huge ammonites have been found. And then we begin to realize why the ocean used to be an even scarier place than it is today. There were sharks, similar to great whites, called megalodon, that would have been at least 60 feet long. Teeth from ancient whales have now been found that would suggest they were 2 to 3 times the size of modern whales. And there were other great sea monsters from 30 to 85 feet long. After life had been upon the earth for some time and human civilization had become very evil, Genesis 6 through 8 and other ancient Middle Eastern stories tell us that a major year-long flood event occurred, which would have caused mass extinctions and major geological changes. The Bible tells us that Noah took 2 of every major kind into the ark. If Noah preserved only representatives of the basic kinds, then we could predict that many of the species and variations that had developed before the flood were buried and became fossils, but many of them became extinct and never reappeared after the flood. The Bible does not describe a local Mesopotamian river flood, for that would not have required an ark to preserve life, nor would it have covered mountains and produced much geological disruption. Genesis describes a massive worldwide event lasting more than a year. The flood began when all of the fountains of the Great Deep burst open, which may have been subterranean waters or volcanic eruptions, and perhaps both, and then the floodgates of the sky were opened, and this would be torrential rains that continued steadily for 40 days. Assuming that pre-flood mountains may have been lower than those thrust up by the collision of continental plates, we are told that the rising water eventually covered all of the mountains, rising to a depth of at least 25 feet above the mountains. The water continued to be at flood level for 150 days. While the Bible tells us that the subterranean water burst forth and then torrential rain continued for 40 days, we tend to forget that tidal action would have continued on a daily basis, increasing until the continents were covered and then resuming as the water was draining into the ocean basins. Increasing tidal flows twice a day for months would produce a lot of strata containing the remains of drowned life forms that became fossils. Great masses of vegetation would be uprooted and washed into valleys and low pockets to be covered with more and more sediments, eventually forming coal and oil deposits. As the tidal inflows reached further inland, larger life forms would move to higher ground before finally being drowned and buried, which may explain why dinosaur fossils are often found near the surface and at higher elevations in places like Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. Millions of large animals are buried in the Siberian tundra and northern Alaskan muck, which runs from 4 to 90 feet deep, with many large animals torn apart and mixed together with tree trunks, but frozen since then continually, preserving fleshy body parts and fur. Whatever the fossil record is showing us, it contains three things that ought to make us wonder. First, all fossils are found in sedimentary rock, which is rock that formed from waterborne sediments. Second, mass graveyards containing bits and pieces of lots of animals torn apart somehow and then gathered and buried together suggests a violent cataclysmic event. And third, lots of complete fossils of delicate small animals and plants indicates that they were buried and preserved rather quickly while still intact and without decomposing. As the tides subsided, large inland lakes would remain, with rain and snowmelt filling them to the point of overflowing. And when their dams breached, tremendous amounts of water were released, eating away soft sedimentary flood deposits and creating major eroded geological features such as major canyon systems. The Missoula and Bonneville floods catastrophically washed over the surface of the land and cut the Scablands and Columbia River Gorge in a few weeks. A major canyon system formed at Mount St. Helens from a breach dam event in a single day. A large area of the American West near Salt Lake City, Utah, and to the west and south, contain the remnants of Lake Bonneville and Lahontan, from which most of the water has now evaporated, leaving flat, dry lake beds between mountains. And the discovery of unfossilized salamander tissue assumed to be 18 million years old, and continuing discoveries of unfossilized dinosaur soft tissue in strata assumed to be at least 60 million years old, should raise questions about how long blood vessels and blood chemicals can last without fossilizing. In a later video about human history, we will see that ancient people were not as ignorant, superstitious, and technologically challenged as the Enlightenment has portrayed them. And the Bible reflects an awareness of things about nature and its processes long before the claimed discoveries of the Enlightenment and modern era. The hydrologic cycle involves surface water evaporating, rising to form clouds of water vapor, then condensing as rain, and draining back into the sea again. There's circular wind patterns. While God provided foundations for the earth so that we may live securely, God hangs the earth on nothing. Rather than a flat earth, God sits above the vault or circle of the earth. God stretched out the heavens, which many today call expansion. Ancient Israel knew that one's mental and spiritual condition affected the physical body. The Law of Moses provided ancient Israel with better sanitation guidelines than existed 300 years ago in England. Life is associated with our blood. Before Einstein's gravitational time dilation, the Apostle Peter understood that time passes at different speeds from different perspectives. While not a textbook on any area of nature, what the Bible does say about nature seems to be in harmony with what is observed over time. It provides a general foundation upon which a lot of further study can be based, which is why, as we will see in a later video, traditional modern Western science began with biblical theists before the Enlightenment. Those promoting the Enlightenment worldview redefined science from a commitment to observation and following evidence wherever it leads to a commitment to limit the possible explanations to those assuming materialistic naturalism, in effect, atheism, regardless of what the evidence looks like. Cosmology, Earth history, biology, human origins, and human history were then all retooled to harmonize with this new paradigm, and we will look at those areas in later videos.